This week, we'll be exploring unsolved mysteries that range from these strange, tiny tunnels found beneath this ancient city in Mexico, to the tragic case of captain and pilot Thomas F. Mantell, who died while chasing after a strange UFO that was spotted in the sky, to the infamous and terrifying cryptid that is the Mothman. We will explore all of these and more, so grab a drink. My choice today is chai, and join me as we explore the unsolved mysteries Iceberg, the Lady of the Dune. So this was an unidentified lady found dead in 1974 in Massachusetts. Well, she was unidentified until 2022, and after doing years of testing on the remains and evidence, and doing many investigations, she was officially identified as Ruth Marie Terry. And she was married to a guy, like literally his name was Guy Moldavin, and he wasn't what you'd call the perfect husband. The two got married in February of 1974, and friends and family always used to say that Ruth wasn't really herself when she was around Guy. She always seemed a little scared, like she was walking on eggshells sort of thing, and apparently Guy was also very controlling and possessive. Then in the summer of 1974, just months after they got married, Guy went to Ruth's family in Tennessee and told them that Ruth had just gone missing, just left their home in California, and Guy had no idea where she went, which sounds suspicious. Ruth's brother actually ended up hiring a private investigator to, try to get to the bottom of where Ruth went, if in fact she did actually go anywhere. And the private investigator came to the conclusion that Ruth had just sold all of her stuff and left the state. And he said, from the evidence he gathered, that she probably did it on her own, and that was basically it. So nobody knew where she had gone to, where she was, and when the Lady of the Dunes was found that very same year, nobody really connected the two. The Lady of the Dunes was found in Massachusetts, and Ruth was living in California at the time. So yeah, as I said, it took until 2022 until the two were finally connected. Now, I guess the big obvious question is whether Ruth actually did run away, and maybe was hitchhiking and then whatever happened to her happened on the road, or whether she was killed first and then this whole her running away was used by someone to cover up the crime. So the first obvious suspect, as it always is, was her husband Guy, and he was a really dodgy sort of fella. He did die in 2002, so by the time the body was found of Ruth, he was, long dead, so he wasn't able to be charged or investigated at all. But Guy himself had a fairly long rap sheet. In 1958, so 16 years before he married Ruth, Guy was married to a woman called Manzanita Eileen Ryan. And just a year and a half after getting married, Manzanita and her 18-year-old daughter both went missing. Guy was obviously investigated and seen as a prime suspect for this, but when police brought him in for questioning, he basically went on the run, which again is a little suspicious. Some would even say a lottle suspicious. He was eventually arrested and captured in Seattle, and so they brought him in, they questioned him, but he was never charged for anything. Even though, and I am not kidding, even though they found dismembered body parts inside of his septic tank. And because they were in the septic tank, there was no way for the police to find out who the body parts belonged to. Guy just denied all knowledge of the body parts, like he had no idea how they got in there, and so he was never charged for any of it, which is absolutely wild. Then, like 4 months after this, he married another woman called Evelyn Emerson, and just a year after this second marriage, he was charged with scamming Evelyn's family out of like $10,000, and for this, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. So scamming a few grand gets you 15 years in prison, and having literal dismembered human body parts in your septic tank gets you just nothing at all. This is a crazy world. But he basically ended up not serving any jail time, as the judge was just like, look, if you pay the money back, then, you don't need to serve anything. So that's what he did. He was also considered to be the main suspect for the murder of a 28-year-old truck driver and his 17-year-old girlfriend, who in 1950 were both killed while out on a date. Henry, the 28-year-old truck driver, was shot dead, and his girlfriend's clothes were folded neatly at the scene, but she herself was never seen again. So it's thought likely that whoever killed Henry kidnapped and then later likely killed Barbara. And as I said, he died in 2002, a free man. He was officially named as Ruth's killer in 2023, and yeah, it's insane to think that he got away with what he got away with for as long as he did, but I mean, at least eventually he was actually charged for something, even though it is after his death. Just a horrific guy and some very tragic cases. Lunar Swirls. So these are these mysterious light and dark swirls that seem to appear on the surface of the moon from time to time. They are honestly super cool and are thought to be caused by these magnetic rocks on the moon that generate these small magnetic fields and interact with the oncoming solar winds. Kind of similar to our northern lights, except just a little less flashy, I guess, and from a different perspective. Malakia Logan was an 8-year-old girl who went missing in South Carolina in 1988. She was out playing with her sister at a nearby park when she decided she was done for the evening, got on her bike, went to ride home at about 8 o'clock, and although her home was just minutes away, she never made it. Nobody saw her after she left the park, and it wasn't until 2 years later, after dozens of searches and investigations and interviews, that some human remains were found of a young girl. And although they tried to get DNA evidence off these remains, it wasn't actually until 8 years after the remains were found that they were able to do so. And to basically no one's surprise, when the results came back, they tested as a match for Malakia. Now, as far as suspects go, there was only really one major one in this case, and that was around the time and location of the disappearance, around this park that Malakia was playing in. Witnesses said they saw a white, blonde-haired man just kind of hovering around the area, and by the time Malakia was gone, he was also gone. So he was naturally a primary suspect, but he was never located or identified. Now, another major suspect in this case was a man named Charles Hampton, and he was a suspect before Malakia's body was even found or identified. At the time, he was in prison for a peeping Tom charge, in that he was found drilling holes through the wall of a woman's bathroom and, spying on them through them. So he was, being prosecuted for this crime. And in 2002, he actually confessed to murdering Malakia and to doing other despicable things to her, which I won't get into because that is disturbing. But he confessed to all of this, and he also confessed to a bunch of other assaults and killings and kidnappings, and he allowed the police to take his DNA, his blood, and he was like super enthusiastic about it. Like, it was just really creepy, his attitude. He was like getting excited by the whole thing. They searched his home and found girls' underwear in his wash. There was photos of girls in his house in bikinis and underwear. There were naked photos of himself just like propped up and hanging around the house. Like, this guy was a massive creep. He even had naked photos of his ex-wife just like chilling. So the police were like, yep, we got the evidence. He's a massive creep. He's confessed to all of this. Easy case. But soon after this, he stopped cooperating with the police. He recanted all of his confessions. And then the police realized we haven't actually really got any evidence on him outside of, some creepy photos that weren't technically illegal and some confessions that he's now recanted. So, we can't use them. So we're kind of in trouble here. Charles had 5 years left on his sentence for the peeping Tom charge. So that was basically the time frame, how long the police roughly had left in order to further investigate, gather evidence, gather other things, and to build a substantial case against Charles so that when he got out of prison, they were able to, not let him go free after he came out for these charges. So they worked away at all that, they built up a case, and when he was eventually released from prison, he was immediately put back into custody. And he was charged with all of these crimes just before all of the charges were dropped. It was at the time a shocking announcement, but police basically said even though they were gonna charge him, they felt like they didn't quite have enough evidence to actually make a conviction stick. And so, due to double jeopardy, they didn't want to try to convict him, have him be found innocent, and then later on, when they found more evidence, not be able to convict him, which, I can't fully blame them with that logic. If they genuinely thought they weren't going to get a conviction, it might make sense to hold out on it just a little bit longer in hopes of finding something more solid. And so, even though the police thought, maybe even felt like they knew George killed Malakia, they weren't really able to press charges and get a conviction. So, officially, Malakia's murder is still unsolved, and the killer is likely still out there roaming around. But rest in peace, Malakia. The Mantell UFO Incident. So this was a quite interesting UFO account that actually rabbit holes down wildly and deeply into this crazy story and string of events. So this whole thing started in 1948 when this flying object that couldn't be identified was spotted by the Kentucky Air National Guard. They had no idea what it was, so they sent out 4 fighter planes to, go and investigate it. And they all went out chasing this thing until one by one they slowly, dropped off, came back sort of thing, except for Captain Thomas Mantell. He was chasing it, flying higher and higher and higher into the sky, and the planes that they were flying really weren't built for this level of altitude. Thomas was asked, advised to, give up chase, come back to base sort of thing, but against his and apparently everyone else's better judgment, he kept chasing this UFO farther and farther, higher and higher, until at about 25,000 feet, Thomas passed out. There was simply not enough oxygen at this level of altitude, and with him passed out, the plane then went into a death spiral and eventually just came crashing down into a field in Kentucky. Captain Mantell was obviously dead from the crash, but soon rumors about what this UFO actually was naturally started to pop up and spread around. And these rumors were, well, they ranged from quite reasonable to really quite wild. Maybe it was a Soviet missile or a secret Soviet flying craft that was faster, more powerful, and more maneuverable than anything we had ever seen before. Or perhaps it was a genuine alien spaceship that, after being pursued by Captain Mantell, felt that maybe he was getting too close, so they attacked the plane and shot him down. There were other rumors and theories about the details of the case that said it was basically a cover-up and Mantell didn't die from the crash, but that when they found his body it was like riddled with bullet wounds, or that there was no plane to be found, as if Mantell and his plane had just, vanished in midair, interdimensional portal sort of thing, or from some secret weapon that just completely obliterated them. And yeah, as I said, a lot of theories. But the explanation that the government originally gave, if you believe them, was that Venus, the planet, was actually the UFO. Yeah, they said that Mantell mistook Venus in the sky for UFO, and so was chasing it, trying to get closer, and, eventually went up that high. And since you can't reach Venus in a World War II plane, no matter how much gusto you may have, he eventually crashed. Then they changed their story and were like, okay, that sounds ridiculous. That's probably not what happened, but let us tell you what did actually happen. We have these, weather balloons that we send up into the sky to detect changes in temperature and help predict weather patterns, and that is probably what he saw when he was chasing it. Then they later said, okay, that wasn't it, and it's like, god damn, make up your mind. But they said, actually, back when this happened, we had this top secret military invention called the Skyhook balloon, which was much bigger than a weather balloon at the time and was apparently used in a few top secret spy missions against the USSR, where these balloons would take various things up into the atmosphere, like for instance microphones, and they would just hover up there in the atmosphere and listen out for mostly USSR nuclear tests. And as I said, these balloons were top secret at the time. They didn't want news getting out about them. They didn't want the Russians finding out about them. And so that's why they were being, super secretive about it. But this secrecy led to people developing theories, people thinking it was an alien craft, and yeah, but bear in mind, this is just the official, statement. I'm not necessarily advocating for this or saying this is how it happened, but this is basically what the government said happened. And people have said that this is also the reason for the Roswell incident, in that, in 1947, this was still a top secret piece of technology, and after one of them went up, eventually crashed down, the government had to be super secretive about this, to protect the invention, protect it from any leaks, so that the Soviets didn't get clue of, what was happening, what they had invented. And so because of all of this secrecy, people thought it was a alien spaceship that crashed. But that's if you believe their version of events, which of course that's maybe what they'd like you to believe if, an alien spacecraft did actually land there. And that could very well be the case. So yeah, as I said, you can go down this rabbit hole for days if you wanted to. It does go incredibly deep into government missions and a bunch of technology that was invented in those days, and secret spy mission sort of thing. And officially this event is explained away. But if you don't believe the official theory, then it is still one of the most tragic, unsolved UFO incidents. Matt and Wendy Jameson's money. So this was a fairly short mystery that involved Mr. and Mrs. Jameson and a bunch of cash. So it was 1995 in Fair Oaks, California, and the Jamesons had just got home from church at around 10:30 in the morning. And after coming home, they discovered tons of notes, well, not actually tons, but like a lot of notes just seemingly thrown over into their back garden. They were all $20 US dollar notes, and they obviously ran over, picked them all up, collected them all. They noticed a few more over the fences of like their neighbors, but they didn't collect those ones. They just assumed that their neighbors had, come home earlier and collected the ones that were in their garden. And after collecting all of them, they decided that it was probably a good idea to go to the police with this, to ask what their options were, sort of thing. And the police told them to put an advert in the local paper, and if no one came to collect it after 90 days, then they were free legally to keep the money. And they posted the advert. Nobody came to collect it, and so the Jamesons legally got to keep the $6,500 that they found. Theories for where it might have come from range from dropping out of an airplane for some reason to someone dumping some dirty money, but still, it is very strange, and to this day, nobody knows where that money came from. The mind-body problem is an interesting, long-discussed philosophical problem of just exactly how the mind and body are connected. Now, there are a ton of questions and points to make on this one, so I won't really have the time or the mental energy to go through all of them, but some basic questions are, for example, just like, how are the mind and body connected? Do they work on two separate systems and they're feeding information between them? Are they just like two parts of the same overall system, like the fingers on your hand, for example? And which of them has more control, if you can even word it that way, or a greater effect over the other one? Like, there's always the age-old joke or question about whether the brain was developed by the body, as like a tool to think and go out there and grab food and bring it to the body, or whether the body was developed by the brain, as the brain needs sustenance, so it develops its body to go out there and physically grab things for it. And I know that's not really how biology works, but it's like an interesting perspective. Like, for example, it's quite well known that your mind can affect your body. So stuff like positive situations, positive affirmations can have a quite positive physical effect on your body. Negative mental stuff like stress can definitely have a negative effect on your body, causing all of these physical health problems, etc. Then there's, of course, the other way, where a physical activity like exercise can actually improve your mental state, and stuff like crying can actually release some things within you and make you feel better mentally. So there is definitely that two-way connection. So it's not really a crime or cryptidy entry, this one. It's more a mystery about we don't really know that much about the mind yet, and it is a wild topic to learn about. The monster of Udine was a serial killer who killed at least 4 women in Italy in the 1970s and 80s. There wasn't too much to go off for this one, but the victims were all linked to one another due to being cut with likely a scalpel all along their stomach area, almost like a C-section. And because of this strangely specific wound on all 4 women, the police suspected that maybe they were dealing with a doctor or a medical professional. But aside from this, police never really made a breakthrough on the case, and so there were never really any major suspects for these killings. As well as these 4 victims that were all thought likely to be from this killer, there were also 12 more victims kind of in and around the area, in and around this period of time, that were thought might be connected to the monster of Udine, but they were killed in various different ways, and so the connection wasn't as airtight as these other 4 women. Still a messed up case though, and since no one was caught for it, the killer is very likely still out there roaming around, free to do as he pleases, which is a terrifying thought. The Mothman is one of the more well-known cryptids in this day and age, and the initial rumors and sightings of its existence originated in West Virginia. And I just love this title, which was the title of the first ever article posted about the Mothman. This was in 1966, and it read, "Couples see man-sized bird create something." Like, literally just that, which makes it sound like I wrote the article. But anyway, it is described as a creature between 7 feet and 10 feet tall, with red glowing eyes, huge wings, and a threatening demeanor. So, I mean, it was all fine up until a threatening demeanor, which again is a very strange description of it. It was seen a few more times after the initial sightings, and theories for what it might have been range from, of course, aliens, come down from God knows where to hunt and torment humans, to a demon, which is a fine guess, I guess. You know, red eyes, shifty, wings, threatening demeanor, definitely all signs of demon. Then there's the theory that it is a misidentified crane or heron, and while these birds aren't typically seen in the area that the Mothman was seen in, some people think it might be possible that they, you know, got rerouted, got lost, and I mean, it's not completely out of the question for these birds to have been there. The birds are quite tall, they have pretty decent wingspans, and a few of them have this red coloring around their eyes, which, you know, might have reflected light and looked like red eyes. But then there's sightings where the Mothman literally hunts people, chases them in their car, even landing on top of their car and attacking their roof, which I don't think a heron would do, but I'm not a zoologist, so maybe I have no idea. There is a yearly Mothman festival held in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, which is where the Mothman was originally spotted, and this festival brings in more than 10,000 people every year. There's a huge 12-foot tall statue of the Mothman, and everyone seems to have a grand old time. So a terrifying creature that might very well still be out there. The Myojo 56 building fire. So this was an absolutely devastating building fire that took place in Tokyo on September the 1st, 2001. It began at around 1 in the morning, and for the next 5 hours, almost the entire building would be caught up in flames. Now, the building itself had numerous safety problems and violations that made this go from a unfortunate fire that killed a few people to an absolutely devastating death trap that ended up killing 44 people. And one of the major problems in this building was that a bunch of the stairwells were kind of blocked out with stuff, and the fire doors were held open. So because the stairs were blocked, it was very difficult for people to, you know, leave the building. And since the fire doors were all open and were very difficult to close, the fire spread very quickly. The smoke engulfed the entire building, as did lethal levels of carbon monoxide. There were quite a few arrests that took place in regards to this fire, but they were basically just all for the building owners and the building managers for, you know, maintaining bad safety standards, not for actually starting the fire. The Tokyo police did eventually come to the conclusion that the fire was started deliberately, and someone was to blame for all of these deaths, but they could just never get that far in the investigation. It was suspected that the owners of the building might have been connected in some way to either the Chinese or Japanese mafia, due to some rumors of, you know, some illegal stuff taking place, some illegal gambling games happening in the building. And so maybe if they didn't pay up what they owed, then, you know, a fire was started. But that's all, at least for now, just a rumor and theory, I guess, as the investigation never did find out who actually started it. When the fire happened, it made pretty big headlines, especially in Japan, but that was all basically overshadowed by the larger attacks that happened in, obviously, New York on September 11th. The Nebular Hypothesis was first developed in 1734, and it was first proposed with an actual theory in 1755, and this theory is basically what we use as the current understanding for ours and basically every solar system. It posits that stars, like our sun, are formed from these huge balls of gas that, you know, slowly clump together over many, many years. And then when this gas comes together and forms the star, there are these accretion disks that just get blown outwards, and these disks end up, you know, rotating around the star, and the matter in those disks ends up slowly clumping together and forming planets. If you want a deeper exploration into this one, I go quite deep into it on my Space Iceberg, and it is some incredibly fun and fascinating stuff. And while this theory does explain a bunch and is incredibly useful, there are still a few basically unsolved things about the theory and about the entire process. For example, why angular momentum is lost on some things that shoot out from the star. We don't really know why or how that happens. We know for the most part how and why medium chunks clump together into larger chunks and then eventually into planets, but we're not not really sure on the early stages on how these tiny particles that are shot out end up clumping together and, becoming medium-sized chunks. Also, why some stars have planets and some don't. Some have dust belts around them, some don't. So yeah, as I said, a very useful theory, but one that doesn't explain everything, and the stuff that's not explained is basically a mystery to us. At least for now. Science is definitely getting there. New England's Dark Day was a very dark day in New England. This was a literally dark day in 1780, and over this general area at around noon, it got so dark that everyone needed to, turn on their lights. Except it was 1780, so they realized, wait, we haven't invented electricity yet, so everyone just had to turn on their candles. This darkness lasted for basically the next day and a half, and we still have no real idea of what caused it. Some say it was smoke from forest fires that, clouded the sky and blocked out the sun, which is a fine theory. Some say it was religious, so God darkening the world for whatever reason, maybe due to sins. But it was a strange few days nonetheless. The Oh My God particle is a pretty cool name, but it was a super high energy ray that was detected in Utah coming from space to the Earth in 1991. This ray was insanely high energy, roughly this many times greater than a standard photon or light particle. And we have witnessed a few cosmic rays that have been similar since this, but this was and still is the most powerful one we have ever detected. We have no idea where it came from, what exactly it is, and if any sentient life did actually send it. And if they did send it, we have no idea why. Planet 9 is this hypothetical planet, not Pluto by the way, but another planet, a ninth planet, that is thought to be perhaps orbiting the sun, but way out, like way out. I mean, look at this image. That's the sun over there, and that little ring, that's the orbit of Neptune, also known as the farthest planet from the sun, at least in our solar system. And obviously, as a disclaimer, this is not an actual photograph, as iPhones have never gone out that far, but this is like an artist's impression or imagination of what it might look like and how far out it would actually be. And for a quick reminder, this is how far out Neptune is compared to, the sun and compared to all the other planets, and this is how far out you'd need to zoom in order to fit in the ninth planet. It would be roughly 250 times further away from the sun than the Earth is, which is very far, and it would take roughly 10 to 20,000 years to complete one orbit. It was basically originally hypothesized to exist just due to some gravitational effects that have been observed this far out, so they thought, actually, it makes sense for something like a planet to be out there. That would seemingly have the effect that we're observing. So it's still kind of a hypothesis at this point, and it's unknown whether this planet actually does exist or not. But if it doesn't exist, then there is seemingly still something out there causing these gravitational anomalies, so that would just become the new mystery. Space. The Pygmy tunnels of Monte Albán. So this is a wildly fascinating one, and Monte Albán was the name for the capital city of the Zapotecs in what is now southwest Mexico. They existed from roughly 200 BC up until like the 1500s when the Spanish arrived, and we don't actually know what the early people called their city, because this was like before the earliest records of writing that we can find in the area. So they were a super old and interesting civilization that had some honestly amazing architecture, and it was similar in ways to some of their neighbors like the Olmecs and the Mayans. They seemed to quite like numbers and calendars, and they were super well connected with nature, with a lot of them believing that they were descended from trees, from rocks, from certain wild animals. So as I said, super fascinating civilization all round, but this entry is regarding some of their architecture, or rather some of these underground tunnels that was found underneath the city, and the exact purpose for them is still to this day unknown. So when the Spanish arrived in like the 1500s, they explored, shall we say, some of these cities, and they got along really well with the local people. That was a joke, by the way. And the story is a little loose, as we often have like accounts of other people, and it's a little mixed up. But one account described visiting the city in like the 1600s, and by this point the original inhabitants of the city had, been killed or moved away or something for hundreds of years at this point. And some of the locals had kind of moved into this abandoned city. They were using some of the underground temples and stuff as like churches or ritual sites. And so the Spanish kind of went exploring, and they found among the ruins of this city this huge underground temple with like these 4 massive connected underground chambers. And these chambers, they said, had been used mostly to bury important people. So in one they would bury like their kings and leaders, in another they would bury their like priests or important religious figures, etc. But one of these led to this deep, dark, underground, gruesome cavern that was full of like the smell of death and decay. It had a bunch of poisonous animals in. So the Spanish were like, yeah, fuck that, and they just sealed up that whole area of it and basically buried the entire thing. And then, to cleanse the area of what they thought was like an attack from hell, they built a church on top of it, which is now today the Church of San Pablo. So that just on its own is pretty cool. But later on in modern times, explorers and archaeologists went to, dig and explore beneath this city, and they went like all out on this. They used ground penetrating radar to try and see any secret passages or underground temples or little pockets down there. They used radars, pulses, just all sorts. And while exploring, as well as a bunch of underground chambers, they found these little tunnels, which were about like yay big by also yay big. So like pretty narrow tunnels that were kind of hard to get through. The excavators were barely able to squeeze through them. They had to lie on their back and kind of shuffle along, which sounds absolutely terrifying. So they shuffled along like this for around 200 feet until they got to this tiny room with a skeleton in, and found stuff like incense burners, a bunch of ornaments made out of stone and precious gems. And so they kept making their way through this tunnel and eventually discovered smaller tunnels with little staircases and stuff. And a bunch of these tunnels were either caved in or blocked off purposefully with stuff like clay, or they were even smaller, being like, this big, like just ridiculous sizes. And so they had to use other methods to try and explore them and try and track them. They ended up pumping a ton of smoke through these tunnels to see, where it went and where it came out. And they found that it came out in a bunch of like really far off, strange places. So it seems like there's this whole underground ventilation tunnel system down there. But for what exactly? Using it for air or breathing or smoke is kind of useless. Like, it doesn't really seem to serve a purpose. It wouldn't really be that useful as something like ventilation. It's not thought that you could use it for something like a sewage system or a water tunnel or something. They seem to be like little tunnels for escape. If the city is attacked, you can go through these secret underground tunnels and exit out at some faraway point, nice and safe. The only problem is just how tiny these tunnels were. Like, you wouldn't be able to fit a fully grown human in them, probably not even a child, leaving some people to believe that there were these small pygmy race of people that at one point lived in this place. Whether they were the sole occupants of here, whether they lived alongside humans, or whether the tunnels are not used for this and were used for an entirely different purpose, we to this day don't know. The ruins are still super cool though, and it is definitely on my list of places to visit. The Rare Earth Hypothesis. So this is basically an exploration of a deeper question, that being, are we alone in the universe? The standard, mundane, cosmological belief is that Earth isn't really rare, in that there are likely thousands, millions probably, maybe way more than millions, of planets exactly like Earth, or at least similar enough, that are able to sustain life. life. But we haven't yet discovered them because, as we all know, space is a very large place. So millions of planets like Earth, a bunch of those being probably more than able to support life, which means that the universe is likely just teeming with life. You know, we haven't seen any so far because we've been here only for a relatively short period of time. Maybe they're not as advanced as us. And of course, the universe is absolutely huge. So if there was, you know, super advanced life over here and we are over here, we may very likely, I think, not be able to detect them. But the rare Earth hypothesis says exactly the opposite. That for our sun to be in this particular spot in the galaxy, that's incredibly rare. And for it to contain the exact matter necessary for something like Earth to develop, and for Earth to be, you know, the perfect distance from the sun in order to create and sustain life, and for us to have a moon which helps with tides, like all of these things are basically, the theory says, a statistical impossibility. So the fact that one of these exists is like crazy enough. The odds of another Earth happening similar to ours, and for life to develop and for it to be sustained, etc., is basically statistically impossible, at least as far as this theory says. So it says that all of this is so insanely rare that maybe at most we'll have a few other similar Earths around the universe and a few other occurrences of life, but nowhere near as much as the regular model says. And because the universe is so huge, it says that it is basically an impossibility that we will ever meet another life form. So some crazy stuff and a pretty interesting question, but let me know your thoughts on this one. Richard Petrone and Danielle Imbo were an American couple who went missing in Philadelphia in 2005. They were out for drinks with another couple, kind of like a double date, I suppose. And at around midnight, they left the bar, walked over towards their car, and then were never seen again. This was the last time they were seen, it was the last time their car was ever seen, and their bank records, their phone records all show zero activity from the day they left. Now, I think for this one, it's kind of natural to think that they maybe ran away. You know, they were together, their car was missing, so maybe they changed their names, got a new bank account, that sort of thing. But both Richard and Danielle had children, and they were fairly close to these children as well. So for them to just run away and leave their kids behind honestly seems absurd, and in my opinion kind of rules it out as a possibility. Police have been investigating this as a potential murder and kidnapping, but they have no bodies, they have no real other evidence. As I said, their car was never found, so it's a incredibly hard one, and for almost 20 years, this case has remained unsolved. Rick and Morty, the new Jared. So, this one is an interesting one for Rick and Morty fans as well as Subway fans. So shortly after the first season of Rick and Morty came out, Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon were approached by Subway, the sandwich company, to make a few commercials for them starring Rick and Morty. In these commercials, Rick and Morty do, you know, Rick and Morty things. Maybe try and imagine the Szechuan sauce commercials. But in these commercials, apparently, they, you know, did silly things, advertised Subway sandwiches, obviously, and claimed to be the new Jared. And this, of course, is referring to Jared Fogle, who was basically the spokesperson for Subway at the time. Now, this is where things get messy, because in 2015, Jared Fogle was actually arrested and sent to prison for 15 years for some really messed up stuff to do with children, which I won't get into, but you can Google it if you want to. And so, obviously, Subway immediately dropped Jared as a spokesperson, and because the commercials mostly revolved around references to Jared sort of thing, with Rick and Morty being the new Jared, these commercials were also dropped. Justin Roiland said the commercials were produced, but due to legal reasons, he can't release them or really talk about them too much. But he did say he put the commercials on 8 different thumb drives, and basically hid them all around America in, you know, random places, in public places, but he won't say where. He did say that 4 of them weren't there when he went to go check on them. So if we believe Justin Roiland, then there are, you know, maybe 4 people out there that have access to these commercials. But regardless, if people do have them, they haven't yet been released to the public or put online. So for now, Maybe not forever, but for now, they are considered lost media. The Riemann Hypothesis is, well, I mean, just look at this. This might be one of the most complex entries on this list. Like, it looks like you actually need a master's degree to understand it. Maybe I'm just being a little dopey, but it is some complex mathematical stuff. That's all you need to know. It is maths, and it's complicated, being one of the few mathematical problems with a $1 million reward. It has not yet been solved, so the money has not been claimed, but hey, if you got an A on your high school maths exam, maybe give it a shot and try and win the million. Robert Hornbeck was a very strange, very sad case of a soldier in America, in Georgia, who went missing after a night out with a friend drinking, and he didn't turn up again for 12 days. This is when guests in the nearby hotel, the DeSoto Hilton, complained about a bad smell in the air, and when staff went up to check on where the smell was coming from, inside this giant air conditioner, they found Robert. He had seemingly gotten very drunk, gone into the hotel in which he didn't even have a room, perhaps stumbled around in there, got lost, entered into the wrong room, like around the maintenance section, and seemingly stumbled into this air conditioning unit, got trapped in there, and ended up dying when a giant fan inside the unit caught him in the head. It is not known 100% certainly whether there was any foul play in this case. It doesn't seem like there is, just because of the way things were set up, but it is always a possibility. The last words that anyone heard Robert speak were to his dad on the phone, who was coming to pick him up after, a night out drinking, and he told his dad that he would be on the steps, presumably outside this hotel, but obviously, as we know, when the dad turned up, Robert just wasn't there, and it took them 12 whole days to actually find him. An extremely sad, simple case with not a lot of mystery, I don't think. The only unknown aspect of this case was really why Robert went in there, why he entered the hotel in the first place, and why he went further and further into the maintenance area, into the air conditioning unit. So a somewhat mysterious, but mostly very sad and tragic case. And that is all we have time for. I hope you're staying safe and staying kind and happy wherever you are and whenever you're watching this. But as always, thanks for watching.